Good morning from New York City. It is a little before 9 a.m. here on the East Coast. I'm Vladimir Gutier in Studio 57.
And I'm Anne-Marie Green, and we are following breaking news for you this morning. Former President Donald Trump has just arrived at a Manhattan courthouse where a historic case is unfolding. We are watching his motorcade now. I think he's probably just there. Today, the judge and the jury are set to hear opening statements in Trump's criminal trial involving alleged hush money payments to an adult film actor, Stormy Daniels. So he is the first U.S. president to face a criminal trial.
That's right. CBS News national correspondent Errol Barnett is covering the trial for us from the courthouse. And we also have CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe to provide analysis. So, Errol, let me begin with you. Describe for us the scene at the courthouse. You've been there since jury selection. What are you seeing that's different this morning?
Great to see you both, Vlad and Anne-Marie. Well, you may hear a helicopter above me. That typically follows the president's motorcade. The courtroom is behind me, so you may see some activity. But as has been the case, the NYPD has really postured itself with barricades, with large vehicles to control any movement of traffic, particularly after Friday's incident where a man went into a public park across the street from the court and set fire to himself. He passed away over the weekend. That park is currently closed, but the NYPD has to strike this balance between allowing the most populous city in the country to do its business. Other court cases are happening. There's plenty of traffic here in Lower Manhattan. But at this moment, Vlad and Anne-Marie, with the president arriving, they've shut down the road behind me to any through traffic and to any pedestrians who are moving. So this is, though, now the beginning of an historic trial where for the first time a former president faces these criminal charges, and a jury which was selected just Friday will be seated and here for the first time opening arguments from each side. Perhaps we'll get to one of the first witnesses as well. So effectively it all comes down to this. It's pivotal, it's important, and there are 12 of how the law sees them, Donald Trump's peers, who will ultimately decide his fate. But the noise and the activity you see around me is all in preparation for this to begin at approximately 9:30 a.m. Eastern.
So, Rebecca, Errol mentioned opening arguments or opening statements. This is when both sides will sort of map out the argument that they intend to prove to the jury. Can you talk about what we might be hearing today?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Anne-Marie. So the opening statements really have three purposes. As you say, it's to introduce the evidence, frame the case, and also woo the jury. So I think, we're going to be hearing from the prosecution. The prosecution has made it very clear what its case is about. They are claiming this was an illegal scheme to cover up information that could have been damaging to the president in the 2016 election. I think it remains to be seen what the defense, how the defense frames its case, because they have floated a number of different and slightly conflicting theories of the case. So I'll be looking for which one they are focusing on. Are they going to focus on the fact that the claim that the president never had an affair with Stormy Daniels? That's not legally very relevant, but important to him politically. Are they going to focus on the fact that the claim that he never had anything to do with these illegal payments? This was Michael Cohen, who had a grudge against him, claiming something that is not true. Or will they go with the question of what his intent was, arguing that this was not an intent to cover up anything having to do with the election? It had nothing to do with illegal taxes or anything like that. What it was for was simply to protect his family from information that could be embarrassing and upsetting.
So I just want to actually kind of drag that out a little bit more and get into a little more detail, Rebecca, because people are going to say, what is it, illegal to want to suppress negative information? Why can't I pay someone to suppress negative information? Because this case, it's not that direct, right? Can you just kind of the basics of the case, the role that Michael Cohen played, and why the prosecution is alleging that this was illegal?
So here in New York, you're not allowed to falsify business records, and it's a felony to falsify those business records with an intent to commit or conceal a crime. Business records are not really the same as personal records. They're somewhat public, and New York considers itself the center of the financial world and has an interest in the integrity of those business records. So the claim here is not that it's illegal to suppress evidence, but rather it is illegal to lie in your internal record keeping when you're doing it with the intent to commit another crime. And you don't have to have committed that other crime at all. So here, the prosecution is claiming that all these lies on these 34 business records were intended to suppress evidence that could have been useful to the public with regard to this campaign, and so formed a kind of finance violation. The intent to do that, not actually doing that. So it's really just about using those lies in the business records in order to try to commit a crime or to try to cover up a crime.
Rebecca, I took note of a fascinating statement, or not a statement, but a fascinating fact that I came across last week, which is that as many as 80% of jurors make up their mind immediately after hearing the opening statements, which we can expect perhaps will happen today. That is, I mean, so how critical, I guess, are these opening statements that we're about to hear, or we're not going to hear them, but we'll learn from later this afternoon?
Between the opening statements and the closing statements, those are critical moments because, the trial is filled with these, important exchanges between witnesses and lawyers that often are a little obscure to the jury. So the lawyers have to provide a way for the juries to see this case. And not only that, but they are trying to give the jurors a motivation to see it one way or another way. And so I think it is really important, more than just introducing the evidence. The lawyers are, as I was saying before, trying to woo the jury, trying to convince the jury to see it the way that the lawyer sees it, the prosecution or the defense. And that is extremely important because as they sit there and listen to what will sometimes seem a little technical, or they may not be able to draw the lines in some of these testimony, it matters how they're looking at things. So it's extremely important. Sorry about my barking dog.
That's okay. So Errol, let's talk about this. Opening statements today. Can you give us a sense of what's on the agenda today and who we might see on the stand?
That's right. Well, to Rebecca's point, remember, there was such a big fight last week over these jurors, and whatever complaints you hear from either side, these 12 jurors, 7 men and 5 women, were agreed upon by both sides. And now they really do hold Donald Trump's fate in their hands. And that's why these opening statements are so key. If each side is able to make its case, you'll have the district attorneys, prosecutors making the case that Donald Trump falsified those business records and therefore broke the law, while Donald Trump's team will say he did no such thing, he wasn't even aware of the scheme. We may hear from David Pecker. He is scheduled to be the first witness on the stand, and he was key to this scheme, prosecutors believe, because he was head of the National Enquirer. He was the chairman of AMI, which published the tabloid, and was instrumental in receiving the payment from Team Trump, from Michael Cohen, and using that to suppress coverage of these alleged affairs with Stormy Daniels, the pornographic actress, and Karen McDougal, who was a Playboy model. He has already been granted immunity by the government for his cooperation in the case against Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen, viewers may remember, he's expected to be a witness. He was President Trump's lawyer and fixer up until the presidential election in 2016, and he facilitated the payments, it's alleged. So he, according to Michael Cohen, he did all this at the direction and for the benefit of Donald Trump, taking this money from Donald Trump, paying Karen McDougal, paying Stormy Daniels out of his own pocket, and then being reimbursed by Donald Trump in these 34 documents, which are key evidence in this case. But those financial records simply talk about legal assistance when in fact it was repayments for the initial hush money payments. So you could hear today from David Becker. We could hear from Michael Cohen eventually. Stormy Daniels, the pornographic actress, could take the stand, which would be pivotal, and Hope Hicks. Many of you may remember as one of Donald Trump's aides at the White House during his presidency, who the government says will be able to connect the dots between the allegations and these individuals and tying it directly to Donald Trump. That will be crucial for the jury because all they need to determine is if Donald Trump broke the law and knew he was breaking the law when he signed off on these legal services repayments to Michael Cohen.
So, Rebecca, one of the strategies I'm guessing that the defense will employ is to undermine the credibility of Michael Cohen, who's been convicted and served some time in prison based on the conviction, because of the conviction. But I wonder if Alvin Bragg and his prosecutors are able to corroborate the statements that Michael Cohen makes on the witness stand. That goes a long way to establishing his credibility with regard specifically to the details of this case. And then you couple Hope Hicks, which no one has suggested has a credibility issue. I mean, they may try to find one, but honing in on Michael Cohen, which I know already that the defense has sought to poke holes in his credibility. But if you have the prosecutor saying everything that Michael Cohen is telling you on the witness stand, we can verify and say that it is true, does that help the jury make a decision?
Absolutely. So as you say, Michael Cohen is a witness with an incredible amount of baggage. I mean, prosecutors are used to bad witnesses, but even on the scale of bad witnesses, he is horrible. So that is a challenge to prosecutors, but it's not an insurmountable one, as you suggest, because really what the prosecutors are going to want to do here is corroborate as much of his testimony as is possible. And that goes a long way. I mean, if they can corroborate every last bit of what he says, well, then, of course, then jurors can believe him because he's just adding color to other testimony. But even if they can corroborate, 90%, 80% of what he's saying on the stand, that begins to make him look like a truthful witness here, even if he has lied a number of times in the past. The other thing that I think, the prosecution is going to try to do is lean in heavily on common sense. So the other thing, there are lots of things that will hopefully the prosecution is thinking will corroborate what Michael Cohen is saying, but they're also asking jurors to do what jurors do best, which is just use their common sense. What do they think is the likely explanation for what is going on here? Is which claim makes the most sense after they've listened to all of this evidence. So those two things are going to become a centerpiece of the prosecution's case here.
Rebecca, certainly there's a gag order when it comes to this case. It's already been suggested that Donald Trump has violated that gag order, mostly by reposting other people's statements that are in violation of the gag order, talking about jurors and stuff like that. He's been sort of criticized for his behavior in the courtroom, whether or not his eyes were closed or huffing and puffing or whatever, glaring. But I'm wondering, Rebecca, with such a high-profile case like this, how much leeway does the judge really have to manage Donald Trump, what he says and how he acts in the courtroom? Because you can't really kind of ignore the fact that we're talking about a guy who's a former president, who is running for president again. You're not going to, throw him behind bars and with the Secret Service along with him. Like, you just don't have the same options that you would have with kind of a regular person. So I'm wondering if the judge is kind of restricted in his ability to kind of manage whatever we might see coming from the former president.
That's such an excellent question, Anne-Marie. So, on a technical level, no, he's just like any other defendant. And of course, the judge can do whatever the judge needs to do in order to control his courtroom. But as you say, there's some technical problems with the Secret Service. There are also optics. In a certain way, the former president has been consistently trying to bait the judge because he wants either to win, or if he doesn't win, to be able to frame this as a witch hunt. And part of the way he does that is by making the judge look unreasonable, unhinged, excessive. And so there's a game going on that the judge is playing in addition to sort of the technical problems he might have with, putting the former president in a jail cell behind that courtroom. There are other problems looming over this case. One other point that I just want to make is that in addition, he had just had this civil trial where there was no jury. There is a question about what he does within the courtroom and how that looks before a jury. I think jurors really do take their civic responsibility here seriously. They are taking time out of their busy lives, dedicating it to try to really help and consider the law and facts. And if the former president does some of the things he did in the courtroom in the attorney general's civil case, I don't think that will play well for him because it looks as if he's disrespecting a process and procedure that I think jurors are really inclined to respect.
Errol, one of the things that we've seen at various trials for the former president are protesters. You have some people who come out and protest Donald Trump, and you have others who are supportive. I know that you said that the police presence is quite robust where you are, but is there an area that's been set up for people to come and voice either their support or their disdain?
No, Vlad, I think what the NYPD is actually trying to do is still allowing a space for the general public to exist and move through and be on the sidewalk and get to the courtroom if they need to, but you can't stand still. In fact, as we were just kind of touring the area earlier just to kind of get a sense of the scene and look at who was around, NYPD wouldn't let us stop and take video and take pictures. They wanted us to keep moving. So they're trying to strike a balance between keeping the area secure, especially considering what happened on Friday, but also allowing the public to move through. When I was here just a few weeks ago covering some of the other legal maneuvers ahead of this trial, there were a small group of anti-Trump protesters, roughly 12 of them, who were walking through the street chanting. They then moved to the park across from the courtroom, chanted, and then kind of left for the day. It was really quite unremarkable. I think they're trying to disincentivize people from coming here. But to Rebecca's point, which I think is a remarkable one, consider that you are a juror in the middle of all of this. You had more than 100 jurors be dismissed and excluded because they said they couldn't be impartial. But the 12 that have been left, including the alternates, are people who truly believe in their civic duty. They're required to be here, and they're taking times out of their busy lives, no matter what it is, to make a decision in this case. And so one of the wild cards certainly is the amount of attention. Some of the jurors said they buckled under the pressure. They were in tears in the courtroom saying, my family has figured out that I'm among the jury and I really don't think I can do this. The jurors who are left think they can, despite the pro and anti-Trump sentiment in the country and here in New York City. And so one other wild card to watch, as Rebecca alluded to, is the former president's conduct in the courtroom. Already there's a gag order Judge Merchan instituted to stop Donald Trump from criticizing the judge, the prosecutors, the witnesses, people's relatives. That will be another aspect discussed this week. But the jury, and this is my experience here in the past 12 months covering these high-profile Trump trials, they absolutely 100% look at the behavior of the defendant, in this case Donald Trump, and they include that in their determination on whether or not they can be trusted. So if this entire case is about payments that Donald Trump made to cover up alleged affairs, and Donald Trump says none of that's true, I had no idea, how likely is the jury to believe that if they see Donald Trump in the courtroom speak out loud, as has taken place? It also took place during the E. Jean Carroll civil defamation trial, you both will remember. And if you remember in that trial where the judge had to narrowly restrain Trump from what he could and couldn't say, that jury ultimately awarded E. Jean Carroll more than $80 million, partly in punitive damages to stop Donald Trump from continuing to defame her publicly. So 100% what we're about to witness in the courtroom behind me and what the jury will see, what they will feel, will absolutely be a part of the calculation when it comes to the verdict that they ultimately will hand back. So you've got the protesters outside. I haven't seen any today, by the way, but certainly you have this attention. You have these jurors whose lives could very well be disrupted. The media is prohibited by the judge from reporting on their occupations, for example, their identities will remain anonymous, except among the lawyers, the judge, and Donald Trump. And so there is a lot of attention and a lot of pressure on this case. These jurors are just, according to the law, in the eyes of the law, they're Donald Trump's peers. They're regular Americans, they're regular citizens here in New York who will determine his guilt or innocence. And so how he acts, how he behaves in the courtroom is likely the most important wild card to watch out for.
Right. That was great. Errol, Rebecca, thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it. Of course, we're going to continue our coverage of this court case. We'll be heading back to bug both Errol and Rebecca throughout the morning. Thank you so much.